So I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled eMASS, The True Story. My name is Steve Warzala. I am the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A few administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. And questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function, and time permitting, your questions will be answered at the end of the session. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Ms. Rebecca Unaskanich. As an Air Force intelligence analyst, she was selected for a special duty position in information assurance. Working at U.S. Central Command, Becca learned the knowledge and skills required to protect our nation's most critical systems. As a cybersecurity engineer, she has assisted several government agencies in ensuring their systems and solutions were securely designed, developed, and engineered. Becca has educated AFRL program managers and research scientists in designing and embedding security early in product development. With over 15 years of experience in cybersecurity focusing on risk management, she brings a level of expertise to organizations and systems working towards compliance, balancing risk, costs, and operational requirements. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Unaskanich. Good afternoon, Becca. The floor is now yours.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. Sorry about the slight delays, but I'll try to get through everything on time. I enjoyed reading through all of the chat boxes about how this is the real story of eMASS. So I know that as someone who uses eMASS on a regular basis, I'm not a developer of eMASS. I'm just an end user at multiple levels. Depending on the system I'm currently working on, I fill different roles. So when we started talking about what the topic would be this month, this is something that I get a lot of questions about as I'm going through eMASS. So I thought I would bring up some of the issues that I've had, how we've worked through some of them, some of the changes that have come out. So if you've been working in the RMF process for a while, you know it's kind of the 6-stage step that's outlined in this special publication 837 Rev 1. So the first step is to categorize the system. So when you're in eMASS and you're categorizing your information system, one of the questions that I get a lot is, how do we come up with our system categorization? Since we are categorizing our systems in the DoD using what's called the Committee of National Security Systems 1253, when you go into eMASS, it actually doesn't help you determine how do you decide what is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability levels. You actually have to use what's called the NIST Special Publication 800-60 Volume 2 to start out with. And then when you go in there and you map your information data types, that helps you come up with your initial baseline for your categorization. So that's one of the things that are in eMASS where you actually have to know to go to the 860 to say, okay, where do I get my system categorization if I'm building a new system? The most important part about this whole process is categorizing your system properly, because from this categorization piece, all of your control selection happens. So if I over-categorize or under-categorize my system, I'm engineering and designing the wrong solutions possibly. I'm either spending, additional funds I might not have to be for security controls, which I've over-categorized for, or if I've under-categorized my system and when it gets to going through the security controls assessment and it gets looked at again, there's a possibility that I have missed something. So understanding how to categorize a system, eMASS doesn't really help you get through that process very well. So making sure you understand to go to NIST Special Publication 800-60 Volume 2, and then some of the services have their own specific categorization assistant documents as well. In this step 2, this is where you actually start your security plan. So much of the security plan is actually built into eMASS, which is one of the benefits of eMASS. It helps you kind of walk through that instead of using the NIST Special Publication 800-18 for your system security plan. You can actually just walk through all those required fields in eMASS, and it'll take you from the first part of the system security plan through it to the controls. Also, the other thing that eMASS does help do is registering the system with the component. So this is where we can tie in which component cybersecurity program we're going to fall under. Most of that starts with whichever eMASS you're registered in based on the service that you're currently, your system's residing in. There are issues that come into play here when you have multiple AOs, authorizing officials, or you're deploying a system across multiple services coming from a joint environment. That's something we ran into quite often, is how do we manage one system that's coming from the Air Force or coming from the Army that's now into a joint environment, and we don't necessarily have access to that information in eMASS. And so that's something where a lot of coordination has to take place to make sure that that happens effectively throughout the process. The other good thing that happens here in the RMF with eMASS is that it assigns the personnel. Under DIACAP, it wasn't as specific as to who plays which role and what their responsibilities are in that role. eMASS does a very good job, and probably sometimes too good of a job, with role assignment. It actually structures and tailors the roles and responsibilities based on permissions. So everyone that is going to be part of your RMF responsibility for your system has to be registered in eMASS to make sure that the system goes through the process. It's a good thing for the RMF process. The problem becomes in the fact that eMASS can be very overwhelming, and when you're trying to put all of these individuals who may not played a role before in this into eMASS, it becomes a learning experience. And when you hand someone a 400-page user guide, it becomes a little bit of a struggle for them. So there is a pretty significant learning experience and gap that has to happen there for individuals that might not have been necessarily involved in the process under DIACAP, and now under RMF, they have to get into the eMASS system. So sometimes as the experts, we have to make sure that we're actually sitting down, walking them through, make sure they understand what's going into the system, what we need their help with, how artifacts get uploaded, how those get mapped. All right, so step 2. So selecting your controls. After we get through the system security plan portion of eMASS and we categorize our system, that gets us into step 2 of the RMF, which is selecting our controls. This is where things can get very overwhelming for all of us. Sometimes I just actually have to shut the computer and go outside for a while and take a little bit of oxygen, because the number of CCIs that are in eMASS is extremely overwhelming. Once I upload my security, once I put in my categorization and my security controls are selected for me, at this point, that's when I apply my overlays. And we'll talk a little bit about overlays later on. But overlays become very important because if we're doing systems such as your intelligence systems, classified systems, their standalone systems, their overlays are either going with cross-domain overlays as well. Your overlays are either going to add or remove security controls based on what's been approved in that overlay. So one of the things that has to happen here is once we apply that overlay, we may have additional security controls added that now we have to look at that are above and beyond what we call the baseline security controls from CNSSI 1253. And there's also, in step 2, that's when we can do any tailoring that we need to do for our security controls. At the same point, we can add or take away security requirements after they have been approved by the authorizing official based on the system mission, the functionality, the connection. There's quite a few things that can tailor controls in or out. One of the things that I've been working on recently is how do we look at resiliency in systems. and what happens from a tailoring perspective, or is that going to be an overlay requirement? So there are places where you're going to look at tailoring your security controls. Again, that has to be approved through the authorizing official's chain of approval depending on the service. This is also where we start developing your continuous monitoring strategy. So eMASS, one of the things that it does do for continuous monitoring is when NIST Special Publication 800-53 Rev 4 tells you you need to do something such as review a policy. In eMASS, they've actually went through and found what the DoD requirements are for how frequently we have to review that policy, and they've put that parameter in there for us. So that allows us to actually go in there and say, okay, well, I know I need to do this annually, and I need to make sure that I'm annually reviewing my policy. So that continuous monitoring strategy starts here in step 2. It's actually you help write that within eMASS, and then your security plan gets approved in eMASS in step 2. And then so now I have my security plan, I know what my system categorizations are, I know what my system description is, I know where it's going, I know who the hosting sites are, I know what overlays have been applied, and I can actually now select what my baseline security controls are going to be for my information system, and I can assign my inheritance, so I know who I'm inheriting controls from, and then now I get to look at what my CKLs actually are for my information system, so I know how I need to build my system. All right, so step 3. Step 3 is actually where most of the system technical work happens. It's where the system is actually built. It's hardened according to the STIGs. The CKLs are applied. I start building all of my evidence. The good thing that eMASS provides in this step for you is that you actually can start uploading the evidence and the artifacts, and it gives a repository for maintaining them. Previously, I've seen a lot of people are managing them on a SharePoint website or, a file server, and it becomes very difficult to figure out which one is the current version, who's done changes, who's made edits. In eMASS, I can actually see when they were uploaded, who's made any changes to my evidence and my artifacts, and I can manage them in that way. So it really does help with the configuration management of my artifacts and evidence. And it also helps me kind of look at all of the security control requirements that I have based on my categorization, my security control selection, my overlays that I've applied, any tailoring that's happened, and then I can start going through my security controls to figure out how I need to actually build, design, engineer that system, what evidence I need to provide, what artifacts I need to create, and then I can start populating that. And this is really where you're going to spend the good majority of your time in eMASS, is doing all of this work. The assessment phase on step 4, this is conducted by your security controls assessor. This is when they actually will change your security control to an official status. So as they're going through the security assessment plan, the SCAs, the security controls assessors, will actually go in there and validate that what you have written and the artifacts that you have in eMASS are correct and current, and they meet the requirements of the control, and then they'll make that control official. Also in this step, that's where any remediation actions would happen. So if we have to, let's say the SCA comes out, they find that maybe my contingency plan is lacking in one specific area, I need to go back and update it. I will go back and update that, reload that new contingency plan into eMASS, and then they can go back and make that an official control. And then authorization happens in eMASS. This is one of the things that I've actually found pretty helpful because before passing around blue folders with sign here, stickies, sometimes would get lost in the shuffle. So having this whole process in one synchronized system, once it gets up to the point where the authorizing official gets to provide his or her approval or denial to operate, this is where eMASS does a pretty good job about that because it lets people know via email that, hey, this is in your queue, you need to go look at this. Here's what the system looks like. Here's all of the non-compliant controls. Here's the plan of action and milestones that are going to match them. And if you want, here's all the artifacts supporting it. And this allows the authorizing official to go in there, make that authorization decision, put that into eMASS, and then it's digitally signed and kept within the information system. And then the monitoring security controls, once we get our system through authorization, all of the controls have to be assessed on an annual basis. So the number of emails that you can get if you have all the email alerts set up can be very overwhelming. I actually have mine filtered to go to a special file in my Outlook so I can keep track of what's coming up and due. But there are a lot of things that happen within your continuous monitoring cycle. It's not actually, okay, I'm done, I'm just going to forget about my system. It's continuously doing remediations. It's making any updates to my security plan, my security assessment reports, my plan of action and milestones. It's my annual security control testing and reporting. It's my cybersecurity compliance reporting. All that happens here in that monitoring security controls, which is, for me, and at least the systems I worked on, much better than managing them in SharePoint or in a file structure and then putting alerts on my email to remember, hey, I need to go back and update my POAMs on a quarterly basis. So I wanted to kind of give a little overview of where eMASS kind of helps each step, and then I wanted to start out with a very positive announcement. So eMASS is pretty helpful. It does automate a lot of what used to be a very manual process. The help manual is very helpful. Every time I have a problem or question or I need some assistance in eMASS or trying to figure out how to do something, I spend a lot of time in the help manual, so I highly recommend using that. It's a great repository for my artifacts. And before it was, I have version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, and I'm trying to remember what changes I made on which document. Now as I'm making these changes, I'm working with my developers, my system administrators. I can just re-upload them into eMASS, and I've got the latest one out there. Also, when I'm working in a team, we can now all be in there at once. We can all make changes to our sections. We can divide out the controls and conquer each piece. I know when someone's making changes, it does that configuration management for me, keeps track of who's doing the changes, what changes are being made, and it flows me through that entire RMF process. But at the same time, it's also quite overwhelming when you're inside of eMASS. So this is one of the systems I'm actually currently working on. So just looking at this, I can see based on my system categorization and overlays that have been applied, I have there on the right 510 security controls. Right now, as I'm working through this, anything I haven't addressed yet, of course, starts out as non-compliant, so it shows it's 376. I got 113 that are compliant. I've got 21 that are non-applicable. I've got 4 that have conflicted controls, which I'm going to cover in a few minutes. And then you can see here that I have 1,923 assessment procedures that I have to address. So those are all coming out of the CCIs, which are coming out of some of your STIGs. And those are the things I have to go in there and annotate for each one of these, how I'm implementing them, how I'm configuring that system accordingly, what artifacts support that, what evidence I have in place. On the left, it gives you kind of the any controls that were added, if I went in there and tailored in any additional requirements. You can see the number that are from my baseline is 396 controls. 114 are actually for my overlays. I have 40 inherited controls, which I'm going to talk about here in a few slides as well as where those inheritable controls come from. I have my 4 conflicted that we'll cover, and then I have 201 shared. And those shared controls are where one of the CCIs or part of a CCI belongs to the system, and we call that a system-specific requirement. And part of it will come from an inherited portion. So it might come from a hosting site. It might come from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, or even the DoD as a whole. So that means that we're jointly sharing the requirements for that control. And then I don't have any self-assessed controls at this point, but I do have what we call Tier 1 common controls. And that is where those controls are actually common across either the DoD in this instance. I have some Air Force Tier 1 common controls put onto the system. So when I mentioned earlier that, when we talk about the roles and we have to put new individuals into eMASS that might not have had to intimately be involved in DICAP so much, when you put them into eMASS, it can be very overwhelming to them. I mean, 1,923 assessment procedures for my CCIs. Some mornings I get in there and I have to shut down and go get coffee and then come back and say, okay, let's start this now. But it is quite a bit to look at in one database. So this is a really good example of what access control looks like. So here's AC2, which is account management. You can see under that the AC 2.1, these are all the test scripts out of 853 alpha, which is your test guide, the 4th revision. So all of those have been bounced against a CCI has been created for them. So each one of those CCIs is where you actually have to go in there and put in the implementation as to how you're meeting that. And so you can see here, these are actually the assessment procedures that are identified in the CCIs by the DoD. And so when you are going through these in eMASS, it gets kind of a little overwhelming, especially if you're new to this entire process. So one of the problems that I've also run across is the tabs don't necessarily always share information and they don't necessarily go in order. So one of the systems that I'm currently working on is actually in development, and once it's completely deployed, it'll go to multiple hosting organizations. And so that's still being decided as to actually where it's going to be fielded. But here's a good example. So PE3, so small. So the physical environmental control, some of them will be the responsibility of the hosting organization in which we'll be putting the servers. So I've come in here and I've set a manual inheritance in my PE3 controls and said it's going to be the responsibility of the enclave once it's deployed to that enclave specifically. But then here on the next slide, slide 17, when I actually go into the tab where I'm actually doing control implementation, it still comes up as an applicable control, and the CCIs are actually still annotated in there. So I have to go in there and do a lot of manual work to actually make this eMASS work effectively in our situation because it's a little bit unique on how we're deploying our system. So slide 18, one of the other things that a couple of our systems have experienced is the migrating from DICAP to RMF. So you do have the system migration button in here that you can push. So in slide 19, you can see what happens when I do that. So it does transition some of my stuff into my step 1 and step 2. So it actually starts giving me like the system name, what my registration type is, what's the version that was currently written. But there are a lot of things that aren't filled in. So I have to make sure I'm actually going through here and adding all of the requirements. So on slide 20, the other thing that you can see is that specifically if you have an Air Force system and you had something like an EITR, an EITDR number, once you transition over, you can't change that. We haven't been able to find any way to update that. If you're using ITIPS now, the Information Technology Investment Portfolio System, when you try to change that number, you get an error message from that. Hopefully that's something that's been put into a change request. The wizard isn't necessarily a wizard. Not everything moves over to transition. One of the biggest issues is that there's not a one-to-one DICAP to RMF control mapping. There's a one-to-many, many-to-one. I think this is where most people were assuming, and me being one of those, that, okay, there's going to be some kind of mapping and some of that stuff will help populate over. And the other thing is that everything, all the documentation and POAM items that you had over as your artifacts under DIACAP, you need to make sure you transition all of that over to your RMF, because anyone can actually go back and see what was there under the old DIACAP package. So for inheritance in the RMF process here in eMASS, so I know specifically because right now I'm sitting in an Air Force system when I'm put together these, but the Air Force and I think the other services have completed an RMF inheritance for our policies. So applying that inheritance level to your application or your system will provide you an inheritance for the such things as the policies, the AFIs, the DoD instructions, for the Army, the ARs. All of those can then apply to your information system, so you don't have to necessarily go back in there and add those manually. So this one here is the Air Force RMF inheritance policy. When you go in there and apply that inheritance to that, it takes away about, I want to say, 30 controls. The one thing I did notice with that is that if there's a control that's been defined as non-compliant by that parent system, I can't go in there and change that status. So there was one particular that was marked non-compliant that our system is actually compliant on at a system level. So we just had to go in there and make annotation in the comment section that was happening. Another issue that we ran into that I mentioned earlier is for our systems that's in development and they'll be fielded at a later date. For these controls that are going to be inherited, and not necessarily from the Air Force inheritance, but from the hosting site, we had to decide, are we going to make those controls non-applicable for the system as an eMASS as it is now? Are we going to make them non-compliant for the system as it is now and put a note in there? Or are we going to create a manual association of inheritance? And that's when we kind of have played around with a couple of times to see which one is going to work the best for that system. And no one really had a one-size-fits-all kind of answer for our unique scenario. We initially went with a non-applicable answer, and that was mostly because, and I'll show you the export spreadsheet later, but when we completed the spreadsheet, we were able to put non-applicable in there, and it updated the entire eMASS set. So slide 22, so these are the overlays. Doesn't look like the whole export worked properly, but so these are the current overlays in eMASS. So when you choose your security control selection and you apply your overlays, this is what's going to make a security control either additional requirement or it's going to make something non-applicable because it's a specific system, something, such as your privacy overlays. It's going to add the additional privacy controls. Your cross-domain overlays will take away some of the requirements, make them non-applicable because of the way that the system is designed to work. But your overlays, you can select them right here in eMASS, which is a great help. Before we were doing it manually, so now I can just go in there and select my overlays. And then there are conflicts in the overlays. So there are times where in an overlay you will have something either marked as non-applicable or added, or marked as non-applicable and it wasn't in the original baseline. Any discrepancies between the overlays and your baseline security controls, those are supposed to be approved by your authorizing official as to which is the correct, is it a required security control to be implemented or is it non-applicable? Once that approval is done and you have the authorized approval, just make that note into eMASS and add any artifacts there. All right, so slide 23, that's what I was saying. Once the security control has been removed by an overlay, it is marked NAO, and then it is not editable by the users. That's one of the, we've had a slight issue in that because I'm working in some resiliency projects, so we've wanted to be able to add something back in, and we haven't been able to do that in eMASS. If it is defined as non-applicable after I apply my overlay, and I've already had that in the system eMASS before, any vulnerabilities for that control that I've identified previously will now be archived inside eMASS, so they'll still be there for me to look at later. Slide 24. So another thing that eMASS actually does a fairly decent job at, it's a little bit manual and tedious, is adding the assets. If you have a large, complex system, this can become extremely overwhelming. I'm working on a little bit smaller system here, so you can see from an asset perspective, the assets have been added, and then inside of those, I know I saw some of the comments on the side before that you were asking about how we add the STIGs into eMASS, so that's where this happens. So here on slide 24, you can see where I've added my my STIG viewer output into eMASS, and it's actually told me here which one are failed, which one are non-applicable findings, and which ones have passed. Okay, slide 27. For those of you that are asking, how do we upload our scan results? This is how you do that. So you're in the Asset tab. You go to Import Scan, and then when you conduct your STIG viewer, when you go through the STIGs and use STIG viewer, you're going to tell it to export a CMRS file, and that's what actually gets uploaded into your eMASS. Now, not all of the STIG tool is the STIG viewer. So when you use STIG viewer and you create a checklist, you can actually take in STIG viewer, you can take your ACAS scans and import the SCAP, the Security Content Automation Protocol, into STIG viewer, and it'll help with finding out which of the controls are compliant and non-compliant. And then I export a CMRS file, and then that gets uploaded here into my import scan functionality. And from there, that's where on that previous slide it'll tell you what's actually compliant and non-compliant. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that since as DISA is updating the STIGs and new STIGs are coming out, they're starting to map them to the RMF controls and the CCIs, but if you're still using some legacy systems in STIGs, not necessarily everything is currently mapped. So you can see here on this slide 29, I actually have some unmapped controls, mostly because we are using an older STIG. I think that might be the Internet Explorer 8 STIG. And so when that comes in here, it just unmaps it because it hasn't been mapped in the STIG itself. So it doesn't, eMASS doesn't know how to handle it and where to put it as a vulnerability. All right, so I think this is what a lot of you were looking for. So the test results uploads. So my STIG viewer, I'm using my CMRS file. I can also do my ACAS outputs from my Nessus scanner. If you're using HBSS for SCAP compliance, that's your host-based security system, you can upload all of those. They don't tie all the CCIs to, so when I have a STIG ID number, the old vulnerability ID number, now it has a CCI mapped to it. When I upload it into eMASS, it doesn't automatically tie it to the corresponding CCI. It ties it to the corresponding RMF control, which I write my plan of action and milestone at that RMF control level. So right now, that inability to tie each STIG vulnerability to the CCI is something that we're working on under the CTMF program. So we're trying to create a tool to automate that feature and then put it back into the STIG viewer, and then so it can upload. So it'll tie right to every CCI, so I don't have to manually go in to do that. So there are some conflicts, too, when you're uploading. So many times we'll parse out the STIGs to the correct SME. So the database, the DBA will get the database STIG, and your app developer, will get your Java STIG, and your system administrator will get your Microsoft Windows or your Red Hat STIG. And so they're going through these inside of their STIG viewer. And sometimes I'm over here working on one of the ones that we had last month was I'm working on contingency plans, writing contingency plans, got the contingency plan finished, but didn't clearly communicate that over to everyone. So when they were going through their STIGs, they marked it as non-compliant. I have it as compliant in eMASS, and now that becomes one of those conflicting controls. So I've got to, typically I just go back and work with them. We update the checklist file and then re-import it, and it cleans up that conflict. But there's the good and the bad, because before we were managing those manually, and now we have eMASS to at least alert us and say, okay, these are conflicts, they need to be fixed. But I can't do it in eMASS, so I can't go into eMASS and just fix what the DBA or the Java developer put in there. I have to actually go back to the checklist file. And then it shows me, it maps it to the controls, so I can look at this and I know CM6 is what many of the CCIs are mapped to. It's just configurations. So here on slide 27, it's just showing these different types of controls that the CCIs are actually mapped to. Okay, so the plan of action in Milestone, it's another thing that's managed in eMASS. It's managed actually fairly well. So if you're used to doing what we call more of an engineering plan of action in Milestone, where each CCI or each old VID from the STIG would get its own line item, now we're actually tying it back to the RMF control. So it's a little hard to see here in the smaller screens. But you can see that we have a plan of action in Milestone for CM6, and it includes all of these CCI vulnerabilities, and so we lump them all into one plan of action in Milestone. There's multiple ways that you can handle this. This is just the way that we did it because there are so many in there right now. And as you're working with them, and you put something as non-compliant, it'll tell you, okay, you need to write a plan of action in Milestone. When I import my scans, it'll tell me I need to do a remediation report or write a plan of action in Milestones. But if you remember back to the previous slide on how many I had, now I have to go in there, and the time that takes is quite considerable. The system that I've been working on right now in eMASS has been about 6 months of work effort, and we're maybe a third of the way through all of the controls. So just when you're looking at it from a timing perspective. So if you want to do the plan of action in Milestone external to eMASS, and I know this happens a lot, especially for vendors that don't necessarily have complete access or sometimes no access into eMASS, eMASS provides you the template, and if you follow the template for the plan of action in Milestone, it can be imported back into eMASS. And I haven't had any problems with that import function yet. All right, so overall, I mean, just with like any large federated system, there's some quirks. There are definitely some things that aren't working quite properly in the way they're supposed to be. There's also, if you have unique systems, like many of the ones that I'm working on, there's not an easy answer as to how to do that in eMASS. And sometimes it does require some creativity. You know, and as you know, things are in constant change for us, which is great. It keeps things interesting, and it you know, keeps us secured. But the other thing is that this constant change of the way business is being done, you know, the updating of STIGs, it's never going to be a 100% perfect system or process. But it's really just making sure that everyone's kind of working together to get through it. Everyone on the team has an awareness of what they need to be doing in eMASS. We keep everything up to date. We keep the process moving. And, you know, really, I think things like, you know, these webinars are critical because it allows you to share information, share lessons learned, figure out what's working, what's not working, ask questions to people who are working on a system similar to yours. And I think that's it. We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Well, thanks for the presentation, Becca. That's good information there. And I want to apologize to everybody for the technical difficulties we experienced today. We had some challenges. So. Now there were quite a lot of questions, a lot of dialogue going on in the chat forum. So we're going to try to capture that information that folks have been sharing. We're going to take that to our website, to csiec.org, and we have a technology forum under the cybersecurity domain. So we're going to try to capture that information and then put those questions into the domain. So we'll probably have that sometime late next week. So what I would suggest is that folks check back. I think we'll probably send out an announcement to everybody to let you know when we have that information up there, and then hopefully in that tech forum we can kind of continue the dialogue in that manner. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up on that. So, but Becca, we do have a couple minutes, so just let me hit you up with a couple of quick questions here. So if I'm developing my system, and what happens if I don't have access to eMASS? How would I go about getting a POEM template?
Yeah, so I've actually been in that scenario a couple of times, working on behalf of a vendor. And what happens there is I usually go to my government sponsor, and especially if I don't have a CAC, and I ask for them to go into eMASS or get someone to go into there, because there's a template for the POEM template is actually in the help function, and then there's actually a template for filling out your security control compliance status, which if you can, I tried logging in with my government computer so I could show it to you. I don't think I have it here. You can actually, as the vendor, if you fill out that spreadsheet, which has all of the CCIs in it, it then auto-populates eMASS for the government POC that's uploading it, so it really saves them a significant amount of work effort to do that way. So the POEM itself is in the help menu.
Okay. And so how do I know what role I need in eMASS?
Oh, what role? Yeah, so there is actually, again, in the help function, there's a whole list of roles and what those roles can actually do. And as I briefly mentioned, the roles are so granular in eMASS, sometimes locking someone down to the ability to do just one or two things. You have to make sure that you're working with your eMASS administrator to ensure that you're getting the correct roles. One of the problems that I've ran into quite frequently is if I have a very, very small office and I have maybe only one or two people doing a lot of the roles, it becomes a coordination effort with the administrator to make sure everyone has the correct roles.
And so can one person have multiple roles then?
They can, as long as it's been approved by the system administrator. Yep. Okay.
And so just one last one before we wrap up for the day. So how is the risk scoring completed in eMASS?
So risk scoring is actually done. It's more of a manual process in eMASS. So risk assessments are kind of the one area where, as a whole, we're still trying to figure out what that actually looks like. If we're going to use NIST Special Publication 830, what does that look like, 39? But there is a risk assessment tab inside of eMASS, and that's where we have to go in there and do the risk scoring. So based on the security controls that we have assigned to us based on our system categorization, we'll go in there and define the risk level, be it very low, low, moderate, high, or very high, using the SCAP levels for risk. And then we'll go in there and look at the severity value of the actual vulnerability itself, again, going to the very low, low, moderate, high, very high scoring, which is a little bit different because a lot of us are used to Cat 3 scoring. So that gets done in the risk assessment tab.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for answering those questions. And once again, thank you for taking the time to do the presentation, share the info with us. It's obviously a popular topic, a lot of interest out there, and folks do have a lot of questions. So thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay, and like I said, everyone, we will be gathering information and putting it up into the tech forum, the cybersecurity tech forum on csiec.org. And like I said, hopefully we can follow up and get the various questions that were posed in the chat session today. Get those out there and get those answers to you folks. So thanks everybody for attending, and I just like to wish everybody a safe and enjoyable 4th of July holiday. Thanks and have a good one. Bye-bye.